Cassoulet! Cassoulet is a slow-cooked, super rich, decadent meat bean stew thing from the southwest of France. Cassoulet dates back a very long time, and some people might actually even consider the dish ancient. And it actually gets its name from the traditional vessel in which it's cooked in, a earthenware pot called a cassoule. Now, I gotta keep it real here. If you're making cassoulet entirely from scratch, which is what we are going to do, it's an involved process. From the ground up, we are going to make fresh sausage, fresh homemade Toulouse sausage. Then we're gonna break down a duck and confit its legs and also render the fat from its skin. We're going to make beans the proper way. Then, of course, we're gonna bring it all together to make the cassoulet. Now, I filmed this video over the course of a few days, to spread the work out and sort of make it work to my schedule and to get that beautiful natural lighting. But if you are an absolute PIMP, you can probably knock this out in one day, not including the bean soaking time, but if you factor that in, you could probably do it. We have a ton to do, so let's get started. Our journey begins with sausage making. We're gonna make a peppery pork sausage that gets its name from a city in France, Toulouse. Our Toulouse sausage will consist of both white and black peppercorns, and if you're unfamiliar, white peppercorns are just a bit earthier and almost musky in a good way. Next is the salt and garlic. The garlic is very important. We need a lot of garlic for this sausage. Like a buttload of garlic. Then just a little nutmeg and our liquids, which are going to be brandy and white wine. You can totally skip out on the brandy and replace it for more wine if you want, but I do think it adds a nice French flair. Okay, onto le meat. Here I have a nice hunk of pork shoulder. It's got plenty of intermuscular fat, but still some leaner areas, so I really like to use it for sausage making. Then we have what's known as fat back, and as the name alludes, it's just fat taken from the back of a pig. Fat is very important in sausage making, and without it, you're just gonna have a dry, crumbly sausage. No good. Lightly toast and grind the peppercorns together, then you can grind these as coarse or as fine as you'd like. I prefer mine on the finer side, but some like it chunky, no judgment. Oh my god. Now we need to scale out and cut the pork up into sort of nice manageable pieces for the grinder. So if you use a stand mixer grinder attachment like I do, you're gonna want to slice the pork and the pork fat into 1 to 1.5 inch cubes. It'll make life easier in the future, trust me. Roughly 1/3 of the weight of the sausage should be made of fat, while the remaining 2/3 can be a leaner meat. All right, pork fabricated and ready to go. Let's season it up. So here we have our lean pork on the leaner side here, and then we also have our fat here. Now it's time to sort of mix these all together. Right onto the pork goes some kosher salt, a giga butt ton of minced garlic, a lot of garlic, all of the pepper that we ground up, and then just a bit of fresh grated nutmeg. I find it's easiest to use your hands to work the spices into the meat, so, gush that pork all around, play that meat piano like Mozart, then pop the seasoned meat into the freezer for about 45 minutes. Meanwhile, we need to soak and rinse our sausage casings. These are natural hog casings made from pig intestines, and they might look, smell, and feel odd, but trust me, they're a lot stronger and simpler to work with than you might imagine. When you're working with natural casings, sometimes they have holes in them, or they're just, they're intestines, so they're pretty imperfect. I like to soak more than I think I'm gonna need, just in case they rip or mess up on me. First, rinse and then soak the casings in cold water for at least 10 or 15 minutes before you use them. Once they're soaked, check for holes by running some water through the casings, like so. Pop those back in the cold water and set them aside for now. Keep in mind when grinding meat, especially fatty meat, it's important that the grinder stays chilly. Alright, so the Toulouse sausage is fresh and coarse, so that basically means that we need to grind the meat through a coarse die, and we don't need to worry about any pink curing salts. As far as sausage making goes, this is the least labor intensive. So some of these pieces here are actually pretty much almost frozen, which is exactly what we want. Not quite frozen, almost frozen. The closer to frozen your meat chunks are, the easier they're going to be to feed through the grinder. Begin by adding the pork cubes to the grinder, then use that tamper to shove them through. As you can see, we have a pretty coarse mixture, and it's ready to go. Now we need to use liquid to emulsify the ground meat to turn it into sausage. Pop the ground meat into the bowl of the stand mixer, and using the paddle attachment, spin your meat on medium for about a minute or two. We're looking for the meat to start smearing together. Yeah. Be careful with your stand mixer, it could overheat. Don't be stubborn like me. If you're using a mixer bowl that's too small, mix the meat in batches. When the meat looks pretty smeared after a minute or two, slowly add the wine and the brandy in, then continue mixing for a minute more. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. If done correctly, you should be left with a homogeneous, sticky blob thing that resembles something like this. Okay, so our sausage is made. Now we need to stuff our meat tubes. Okay. With the sausage stuffing attachment on, feed some sausage through the tube, then apply a soaked hog casing. I mean, Jesus Christ, these jokes are all layups. I don't even know where to start. So, we're just not gonna go there today. Once all the meat is ran through, pinch the tip and tie off the end. Come on, man. Alright, but for real, there you have it. Fresh Toulouse sausage from scratch, from my home to yours, but we aren't done yet. Okay, so now we're just gonna poke some holes in these sausages, a lot of holes, just so that they don't burst on us. If you don't have a sausage poker, which, why would you? Go ahead and just use a cake tester or a wooden skewer. Now, I should mention that you can totally skip this next step and keep the sausages whole, but forming links makes kind of portioning the sausages and freezing them a lot easier. To make links, start by twisting the sausage one way, then reversing the direction that you twist with each link. Doing so is going to ensure that the whole thing doesn't just sort of unwind on you. As you can see, this recipe makes more sausage than we need for cassoulet, but if you're whipping out the grinder, why not make a bunch? So, they freeze well. Oh, and just store the leftover casings in salt. They'll last for a while if you do that. Duck time. Here I have one whole duckling. These days, it's not too hard to buy straight-up duck legs from either a butcher or even at your local grocery store, but buying that whole duck gives you 2 extra breasts, bones for sauce or stock, and of course, loads of skin that we can render into fat. Alright, so fabricating a duck is similar but different than doing a chicken. Ducks have big rib cages, so it's important to keep that in mind and keep your knife pressed to the rib cage so that you can cut into the thigh like so. Then, just like a chicken, dislocate that thigh bone from the body and flip the bird around. We want as much of that thigh meat as possible, so make a nice long cut down the spine of the duck and do your best to get that oyster meat. Finally, cut the thigh off the body, and there you have it, one duck leg. Just do the same thing on the other side, and when you have all the meat off the duck, be sure to go back and remove the rest of the skin. Skin equals fat, so do not skip out on this step. Lastly, just clean up the thighs and the breasts by removing any excess skin and add it to the pile. Remember, when working with meat, especially raw poultry, it's important to keep your surface moist and spiffy, which means washing and sanitizing your board. Do you like my skin collection? Now add all dem skim trimmings to an appropriate size pan and place it over the burner on low heat. The goal is to slowly coax out the fat from the skin, which takes time, so be patient. While that skin renders, let's prepare the duck legs for confit by salting them generously on both sides, then showering over some aromatics. I'm using a fairly classic combo of black pepper, garlic, thyme, and orange zest. Confit, meaning to cook something in fat, is actually an old preservation technique that was commonly practiced by French peasants back in the day. Traditionally, duck legs were packed in salt and curing salt to prevent spoilage, but these days, because of modern refrigeration, we don't have to worry about that. Pack up the salted duck legs and set those in your fridge. If you'd like, you can do this step 3 days in advance or so before you want to finish the confit. By now, the duck skin should look shriveled and some fat should be at the bottom of the pan. Once the duck skin looks like browned chicharrones, go ahead and strain off the fat and store it in a container. We're going to use it in the next step. And you can definitely get more fat if you render the skin longer. I just had to leave the house and didn't want the duck fat sitting out for the cat to slurp. Alright, day dose. Today is mostly hands-off. We're going to confit the duck legs and pre-soak the beans. Remember, confit means to cook something in fat. I'm going to use 100% duck fat, but especially if you don't have fresh duck skin to render, that can get pricey. So if you're watching your Benjamins, feel free to use a 50-50 mixture of duck fat and a neutral oil, or just use a light olive oil instead. It'll still be tasty. It's worth mentioning that duck confit can also be done on the stove, but I prefer to do mine in the oven so it keeps my stovetop open. With cold water, wash the salt off the duck legs, then pat dry and place in a tray or pan. Really do your best to get all the salt off. This is a modern confit. The salt's job is to season, remove moisture, and lightly brine the duck legs, not preserve them completely. These days, we confit more for flavor and less for not starving to death. If using duck fat, be sure to warm it up to liquid, then pour it over the leggies just to cover. Then with some foil, be sure to really seal it up. I like to use 2 layers of foil to ensure that it's nice and taut. Then it's into a 200° Fahrenheit or 93 Celsius oven for 5 to 6 hours. Of course, cooking time varies on the oven, the size of the duck legs, the cooking vessel, and so on. This time and temp is going to yield us classic, shreddy, luxurious duck confit. You'll know when the confit is done when it's ultra tender and easily pierced with a small knife or cake tester. Just be sure not to destroy the product while testing. Okay, so I know it's gonna be tough, but refrain from touching the confit. This needs to cool in its fat until it reaches at least room temperature. Now, I actually have to go to work in about 20 minutes, and there's no way that this is gonna cool before I have to leave. So, I'm just gonna wrap this up in foil, pop this on my stove, let it come to room temperature, and pray to Zeus that my cat doesn't go for it. You hear that, mister? Do not eat my duck confit. Also, it's definitely worth mentioning that if you are a sous vide boy/girl, you can achieve a very similar result by bagging the legs with aromatics, then cooking at 185 Fahrenheit for 6 to 8 hours. Let's talk beans. Traditional cassoulet calls for a certain variety of large white runner bean called tarbay, but they can be tough to find unless you special order them, so feel free to sub for navy beans or some sort of large white kidney bean if you need to. We are going to soak the beans overnight to plump them up, which in my opinion is going to make them easier to cook and more tender and meaty. Cover the beans with water by at least a few inches and set them aside for at least 12 hours. Finally, the day of reckoning is upon us. Okay, so before we begin, I think it's going to be helpful to kind of get a bird's eye view of just, what goes into a cassoulet. As you can see, there's plenty of stuff here. Starting with the meats, we have our duck confit, our Toulouse sausage, a few pork spare ribs, the ham and the pork belly, then a load of aromatic vegetables for the beans, our duck stock, fat and vinegar, and of course our beans. Notice just how much water those beans absorbed. It's pretty wild. I saved a dry bean to compare just how much the beans increase in size after soaking. The soaked bean is at least 3x the size of the dry, so, don't skip the pre-soak. Very important. I generally soak more beans than I think I'm going to need and just save the leftover for later use. It is now time to cook les beans. Okay, so we're gonna make what's called a bouquet garni, herb sachet, whatever you wanna call it. Essentially what we're doing is wrapping small, loose aromatics in a cheesecloth so that they're easier to extract after the cooking process. Simply unwrap your cloth and begin packing the aromatics in. I'm using fresh parsley, thyme, and bay leaf, a few cloves of garlic, and some warm spices. We have our black peppercorn, our clove, and our juniper berry. Sprinkle those over the top and roll it up. Roll up for the boys. And honestly, I wouldn't hold it against you if you decided to ditch this whole cassoulet thing and smudge your house with this little smelly bundle. No judgment. To cook the beans, start by layering in the meat. The French like to use pork rind, but I prefer pork belly, so in with some pork belly and the ham. Then, of course, our beans. Plop those right on top over the meat. Then start layering in the flavoring agents, which are 1 whole onion, 1 carrot, 3 tomatoes, just sort of sliced in half, no need to chop them up, our tomato paste, and salt. Salting beans is very important. You want to make sure that you add enough salt in this mixture. It's not going to be good if you don't add enough, so over the top. Just as important as the salt is fat, so spoon in some duck fat, don't skimp out. Beans need plenty of salt and fat. Then a bit of acid in the form of red wine vinegar and the herb sachet. Now pour over some chicken or duck stock and cover the beans by an inch or 2. Try to use real stock here. We really want that collagen. Bouillon has a time and a place, but in this case, try to keep it real. When cooking beans, a good rule of thumb to remember is that if the cooking liquid tastes good, your beans are likely to taste good as well. Set that on medium-low and simmer the beans until tendy. While those are rolling, we're going to crisp up our duck confit skin so that we don't have to worry about it later. Pop the legs on a sheet tray and slide them under the broiler for 5 or so minutes, or really until the skin gets nice and crispy. When they look like this, set them aside. We're going to come back to them soon. As the beans simmer in the background, scum and gunk is going to float to the top. Just like you would when making stock, skim all those gnarly bits off the top and keep the beans nice and clean. Trust me, it does make a difference. Alright, so the beans are nearly finished. We are almost ready to build the cassoulet, but first we're going to saute the meat that did not go into the beans to generate some roasty flavors. Here I have some pork spare ribs, the sausage, and some aromatics. Add a bit of duck fat and a touch of neutral oil to a hot pan, then in with the pork ribs, the Toulouse sausage, some thyme, and bay leaf. Cook all that until things get some nice color, then set them aside. By now the beans should be finished. Give them one final skim, then we're going to remove all of the aromatics and meat. Keeping the veggies whole is super nice because they're super easy to remove. We want everything out, but don't worry about little pieces of tomato that melt into the mix. Those are actually super delicious in the cassoulet. Finally, reserve the ham and pork belly from the bean cooking liquid and set those aside with the other meat that we just roasted. Then move the beans out the way. To prepare the meats for the cassoulet, cut them into manageable pieces, and this part's really preference. I like to cut mine into some chunks, I like to shred some with my hands for varying textures, totally your call. Some people like to leave their sausage whole, but I prefer to cut it up so that, it's sort of distributed throughout the cassoulet, but, do whatever makes you happy, live your life. Then, for good measure, I like to sacrifice a piece of confit by shredding it up and adding it into the pile. Traditional cassoulet is made in a large casserole-style clay pot, which, aren't really a thing where I live, so I like to use a Dutch oven, also called a cocotte. Finally, the time has come to build the cassoulet. We're gonna start by layering in our meats. There isn't a real order for the meat. So long as you lay it in before the beans, you'll be Gucci, so go ahead and just do that. After the meat, spoon in the beans and only the beans. Do not add any of the cooking liquid just yet. Then, once the meat and beans are packed in, pour in some of that sweet, sweet bean cooking liquid just to reach the beans. Do not submerge them entirely, you'll see why in a bit. Alright, phew, the heavy lifting is over. Just move the entire thing into a 400-degree Fahrenheit oven for about 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, the liquid should look almost completely evaporated. The top layer of the beans should be on the drier side and start taking on some color. Use the back of a spoon to crack and press the beans down, then pour more of that cooking liquid over just to reach the top like last time, then it's back into the oven for another 30 minutes. Repeat this process every 30 minutes for a total of 3 press and pours, so about an hour and a half total, but that can vary. It's usually best to cook by sensory cues and not time. The goal with pressing and pouring is to dehydrate then rehydrate the beans to get a really nice crust on the cassoulet. On the final press and pour, top the cassoulet with the duck confit and cook for another 15 minutes, just enough to warm the confit through. Alright, moment of truth. Ooh, yeah. There she blows. Though it could seem a little fancy and definitely intimidating, at its heart, cassoulet is French peasant food. Think about it, cassoulet's anatomy consists of inexpensive pieces of pork, beans which farmers were, able to grow in abundance, and of course heavily salted duck legs. Not to mention the dish is so rich that you really can only have 1, maybe 2 portions tops before feeling full to the brim. Between the crusty top layer and bottom gooey layer of beans and multiple kinds of meats, cassoulet is the epitome of humble, soul-warming, and incredibly delicious food. It's really just pork and beans at its finest. This is probably one of the richest dishes known to mankind. Actually, not exaggerating here. Something you can do to sort of cut through that fat, cut through the richness, make it a little more palatable. Drizzle over a tiny bit of some good vinegar. This is just a Pinot Noir vinegar. I tend to like red wine vinegar, but whatever vinegar sort of floats your bee is gonna be good here. So just gonna drizzle a little over the top. And that's really that. From here it's all instinct. So, chow down, amigos. Wow. That is what 3 days of labor tastes like. This video has been an idea of mine for well over a year, for a very long time. And I feel proud, definitely relieved, and also fortunate all at the same time, sort of, to be able to share it with you. I fell in love with cassoulet after watching Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace, and the guys over from Joe Beef in Montreal. They were eating canned cassoulet on a hunting trip, and I was intrigued by it. Yes, canned, preserved cassoulet does exist. And of course, being the weird, hyper-curious person I am, I had to get my hands on some. I scoured the internet until I could find, a French-Canadian canned cassoulet. Don't ask. After that experience, I became curious on what goes in, what components go into the real dish itself, the history behind it, that sort of nerdy stuff, and here we are. A heartwarming story about a man, beans, and meat. That's compelling content. If you're still here, you are amazing, and I want to thank you so much for sticking around and watching the full video, and through the transitive property, supporting the channel. So happy cassouleting, and I will see you next week. Au revoir.